Imagine you're the top military commander of a whole nation.
Right. High stakes.
Exactly. Your troops are actively deployed. The geopolitics of your region are, incredibly tense. And you're arguably one of the most visible public figures in your country.
Oh, for sure. Everyone is watching you.
Right. And then, completely without warning, you just vanish from public communication. You delete your primary social media account, which cuts off this direct line to millions of people, and your official excuse for vanishing: spiritual instruction.
Yeah, that immediately forces us to look past the surface, right? Because when someone operating at the very peak of military and political power suddenly silences themselves like that, that silence is rarely an accident. It's almost always a highly calibrated strategy.
Welcome to today's Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we are unpacking the digital disappearance of Muhoozi Kainerugaba from the platform X.
And I'm so glad to be here to help break this down, because managing a digital footprint, it's no longer just a secondary concern for modern leaders. It's really become a core component of statecraft.
It really has. We're going to examine what it actually means when a nation's top military commander unplugs from the internet. And for you listening, we've got a really fascinating stack of sources guiding our conversation today.
Yeah, we're pulling from reports by TRT Africa, the East African, the Citizen, Business Insider Africa, and the Star.
Right. And they cover the official statements, the really severe diplomatic fallout, and of course the underlying political strategies at play.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it's just so unusual for someone with a massive, highly scrutinized online presence to just vanish overnight.
It's basically unheard of these days.
Exactly. So the central question we need to answer for you today is this simply a matter of a man returning to his day job, stepping away from the stream to do actual military work? Or is there this complex web of diplomacy, damage control, and long-term political maneuvering hiding behind that deactivated account?
Well, to figure that out, we really have to start with the narrative that was deliberately constructed for public consumption, the official lines.
Right, what he actually said. Yeah. If you look at the reporting from TRT Africa, Muhoozi publicly announced he was stepping away from the platform to concentrate entirely on his duties in the UPDF, the Uganda People's Defense Force. He presented it as the strict return to military focus.
But then Business Insider Africa highlighted this entirely different layer to his explanation. He also stated that he was guided by religious conviction.
Oh, yeah.
He claimed this spiritual imperative to refocus on his duty. And I read a lot of military history and political communications, and military leaders generally talk about operational security or protocol or chain of command when they change their communication strategy.
Right, exactly. They stick to the manual.
Yeah. They very rarely cite religious conviction or spiritual reasons for taking a social media break. To me, it just immediately strikes me as a really proactive public relations strategy, like a CEO saying they're leaving to spend more time with family.
That's a great comparison. It's basically a masterclass in institutional reputation management. Because think about the mechanics of how a sudden departure would normally be perceived.
People would assume he got in trouble.
Precisely. If a high-ranking official abruptly deletes their account, the immediate public assumption is that they were reprimanded. It looks like a forced retreat, or worse, just an embarrassment.
Right.
But by framing this exit as a higher calling, whether that's an unwavering devotion to the armed forces or this deep religious conviction, he completely inverts the optics.
So instead of the narrative being, he was forced off the platform, the narrative becomes he is ascending to his true responsibilities.
Exactly. It turns a reactive withdrawal into an active, virtuous decision. He's telling the public that he isn't running away from controversy, he's just rising above it.
Wow.
Yeah, it reclaims control of the timeline. And what adds this fascinating, almost surreal layer to this is the history detailed by the Star. Because this isn't a new tactic for him.
Wait, really? He's done this before?
Yeah. He has actually claimed to be under spiritual instruction in the past, and not just for leaving the platform, but for returning to it later.
Okay, that is a critical detail right there. He uses the concept of spiritual instruction as this all-purpose shield to manage his engagement.
Yep.
But, if this narrative of discipline and a higher calling to military duty is genuinely just a smokescreen, the obvious question is what that smoke is hiding.
Right. What is the actual catalyst here?
Exactly. If we assume his departure wasn't actually driven by a sudden, overwhelming urge to study military doctrine, we have to look at what made his online presence so fundamentally incompatible with his position.
And that requires us to shift our focus from his stated reasons directly to his actual digital footprint.
Mm.
When you look at the history compiled by TRT Africa, you see a pattern of communication that goes way beyond standard political banter.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Because the digital trail isn't just a few controversial opinions. We're looking at a history of highly provocative and sometimes outright threatening statements.
Yeah, the sources explicitly mention his comments targeting opposition figures like Bobi Wine.
And for those listening who might not follow Ugandan politics closely, targeting Bobi Wine isn't just a casual political swipe.
No, not at all.
Bobi Wine represents a massive generational and cultural divide. He has a huge following, particularly among the youth, and is a major political challenger. So when the top military commander uses his platform to troll or threaten the primary opposition figure, it really inflames an already deeply polarized electorate.
It fundamentally blurs the line between a personal social media account and state-sanctioned rhetoric. And that blur is exactly what triggered the most severe consequences mentioned in the sources.
The diplomatic stuff, right?
Exactly. While the domestic friction was intense, TRT Africa notes that his remarks sparked actual, tangible diplomatic issues with neighboring countries. Specifically, tensions arose with Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo based directly on things he posted on X.
This is where the mechanics of modern statecraft just collide head-on with social media. Because, we see politicians troll each other online every single day.
Oh, constant.
In a lot of places, it's just treated as a cheap tactic to drive engagement. But the difference here is his rank and his lineage. He is not just a civilian politician. He commands the actual military forces, and he is the son of President Yoweri Museveni.
Right, and that changes the entire context of a tweet.
Exactly. I would argue that to a neighboring country like the DRC, which is, massive, resource-rich, and has a deeply complex history of conflict and border tensions with Uganda, a tweet from the UPDF commander isn't just a troll. It's analyzed by foreign intelligence agencies as a leak of state intent.
Your distinction between civilian politicians and military commanders is really the crux of the issue here.
Yeah.
Because diplomacy relies entirely on predictability, careful protocol, and plausible deniability.
You lose on social media.
Completely. If a low-level diplomat misspeaks, a government can claim they were acting out of turn. But when the commander of the armed forces broadcasts provocative statements about sovereign neighbors, plausible deniability evaporates.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
Sudan is currently navigating immense internal turmoil, and the DRC is managing highly fragile security situations involving various rebel groups. In that kind of tinderbox, a single unvetted tweet from a neighboring military leader can mobilize troops or collapse delicate diplomatic channels.
Because in a highly centralized government, foreign embassies just assume that the president's son speaks with the implicit backing of the state. They don't have a luxury of assuming he's just, joking around on his phone.
That is the harsh reality of the geopolitical landscape. The sources point out that these controversies created immense, mounting pressure on him to step back.
Like actual government pressure.
Oh, absolutely. Ambassadors likely had to be summoned, private assurances had to be made between heads of state, and tensions had to be actively de-escalated by the diplomatic corps, all to counteract a handful of posts on an app.
And the Citizen brought up another crucial angle to this friction, which I found fascinating. It wasn't just international pressure. There were deep concerns internally about maintaining respect for the presidency and the Constitution itself.
Right, the institutional damage.
Yeah. The criticism surrounding his tone wasn't merely that it was undiplomatic. It was that the erratic nature of the communication was actively eroding the institutional dignity of the highest offices in Uganda.
And we really have to remain strictly impartial and analytical about the mechanics here without endorsing or condemning the specific political actors involved.
Absolutely.
Whether you view Bobi Wine favorably or unfavorably, or regardless of how you view the Ugandan government's policies, the undeniable reality reported by these sources is that the tweets generated severe institutional friction. They created a constitutional and diplomatic headache that the government could no longer afford to sustain.
So if we piece together the immediate catalyst, the digital disappearance was essentially an act of emergency diplomatic damage control.
A firebreak.
Yeah, a firebreak. There were geopolitical fires burning with neighbors, constitutional anxieties bubbling up domestically, and the absolute fastest way to stop the bleeding was to sever the communication line entirely. But taking a step back from the keyboard to stop a crisis today doesn't explain the long-term strategy. And that brings us to the broader timeline.
Which is where the analysis from the East African becomes absolutely essential, because political analysts looking at this region strongly suggest that this departure is not just a reactive measure.
It's a calculated move.
Very calculated. It's a forward-looking maneuver tied directly to the upcoming 2026 Ugandan general election.
Ah, the long game. The East Africans suggest there are two dual goals driving this strategic silence. First, to drastically reduce his public visibility in the short term. And second, to mitigate the ongoing, persistent claims that his father, President Museveni, is actively grooming him to take over power.
The grooming narrative is incredibly potent in any political environment, but especially in one where a single leader has held power for decades. It inherently questions the legitimacy of the successor.
Right, because it looks predetermined.
Exactly. If the public and international observers believe a presidency is simply being handed down like a family heirloom, it completely undermines the democratic credibility of the entire transition process.
So think about how a movie studio handles a massive blockbuster. Sometimes the studio realizes they released the trailer way too early and revealed too much of the plot. The audience is already picking the movie apart, making assumptions, and deciding if they hate it before the film is even finished.
Oh, that happens all the time.
Right. So what do? The studio pulls the trailer, stops the marketing, and lets the hype completely reset. They create a vacuum so they can reintroduce the movie later on better terms. That feels exactly like what is happening here with his public persona.
It's a great analogy.
But I have to challenge this logic for a second, just to play devil's advocate. If the goal is to dispel the rumor that a grand plan is in motion for him to take power in 2026, does going completely silent actually help? Doesn't a sudden, highly coordinated disappearance almost confirm to everyone watching that a serious political operation is underway?
That is the ultimate paradox of political silence. Does it cure the rumor, or does it serve as an amplifier?
Exactly.
But if we synthesize the diplomatic realities we just discussed with the looming 2026 elections, the strategic logic becomes a bit clearer. If the ultimate objective is a smooth, internationally recognized, and domestically stable transition of power, certain conditions must be met.
You need allies.
You need neighboring countries that trust your stability, and you need a domestic population that views you as a serious, disciplined statesman.
Right. You can't be alienating Sudan and the DR Congo while simultaneously trying to convince the Ugandan electorate that you are the steady hand ready to guide the nation's future. The digital provocateur persona is fundamentally incompatible with the presidential successor persona.
Exactly. Alienating regional partners and showing perceived disregard for constitutional norms via social media is just catastrophic for a long-term presidential strategy. So reducing his visibility right now serves a very specific utilitarian purpose. It allows the public memory of the controversial tweets to fade.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Precisely. By stepping back into the shadows of the military apparatus, he is executing a rebranding campaign achieved entirely through abscess.
Which loops us perfectly back to his official, stated excuse from the very beginning. The spiritual instruction and the devotion to military duty isn't just a shield, it is the new brand.
It replaces the image of the unpredictable, impulsive poster with the image of the stoic, disciplined soldier who's entirely focused on national security.
Wow.
It doesn't necessarily kill the grooming rumors, but it fundamentally changes the character of the man allegedly being groomed. It attempts to mold him into a traditional, serious leader in the eyes of the public and international observers, rather than an internet personality.
It is rebranding by erasure. You delete the app, you delete the controversial persona, and you let the uniform and the silence do the heavy lifting for your reputation.
Yeah.
But we have to look at the reality of this strategy, which is that this departure is almost certainly just a pause. It is a tactical retreat, it's not a full stop.
No, not at all. All the evidence in the sources points to that conclusion. TRT Africa noted that when he announced his departure, he explicitly told his followers that he would return at an, quote, appropriate time. He deliberately left the door open.
And as we touched on earlier from the Star, he has executed this exact maneuver before.
Right, the cycle.
Yeah, deactivating, citing a higher calling, letting the controversy die down, and then reactivating when the strategic environment is more favorable. It's a cyclical tool of political engagement for him.
It really reveals a profound shift in how we need to understand modern leadership. Managing a digital footprint, knowing exactly when to speak, when to provoke, and crucially, when to vanish, is now just as critical to national security and political survival as managing real-world assets.
That's a wild thought.
A misstep in the digital space requires a highly coordinated, strategic reorganization in the physical world.
So what does this all mean for you, watching these global events unfold? It shows us that a simple, everyday action, like just clicking a button to deactivate a social media profile, is never really simple when you operate at the apex of military and political power.
It's never just logging off.
Exactly. It isn't just a matter of logging off to clear your head. It is this fascinating nexus where military duty, delicate international diplomacy, and the long-game strategy for a national election all violently intersect.
Every single action and every deliberate inaction is weighed against its geopolitical consequence.
And that leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to mull over today as you look at the communication of the leaders in your own life. If deactivating a social media account is now being deployed as a sophisticated, strategic tool to reset a political image and manipulate public memory, how much of modern political power actually lies on what these leaders broadcast to the world versus their highly calculated silences?
It's a great question.
And perhaps more importantly, when a leader utilizes a strategic silence to rebuild their